Samuel Whitmore lived alone in a weathered cabin on the edge of Cedar Creek, where the Montana wilderness stretched endlessly toward the horizon. His nearest neighbor was a full day's ride through pine and aspen, and that suited him just fine. At 32, he had never known the touch of a woman or the warmth of a family hearth beyond his own solitary fire. The townspeople of Birch Falls whispered about him when he made his monthly trips for supplies. The Virgin Hermit, they called him behind cupped hands, their voices carrying equal parts mockery and pity. Samuel heard them, but their words rolled off him like water off oiled leather. He had found his peace in the company of elk and eagles, in the steady rhythm of splitting wood and the gentle murmur of the creek that bore his valley's name. His days followed patterns as predictable as the seasons. Dawn brought coffee brewed strong and black. Then hours spent checking his trap lines or mending the roof that winter winds had loosened. Afternoons were for fishing the deep pools where trout gathered like silver coins beneath overhanging willows. Evenings found him carving by lamplight or reading from the few books his mother had left him, a Bible, a volume of Shakespeare, and a collection of frontier poetry that spoke of lonesome men and endless skies. Samuel's mother, Rebecca Whitmore, had been the only woman to ever love him. She had died when he was 20, carried off by a fever that no amount of prayer or medicine could break. Her final words still echoed in his memory. "Kindness given in silence speaks the loudest, Samuel. Remember that when your time comes to choose love over loneliness." He had built his life around those words without fully understanding them. When travelers occasionally lost their way and stumbled upon his cabin, he fed them without question and offered shelter without payment. When winter struck hard and animals grew desperate, he left grain and salt licks where hungry deer could find them. The forest knew his kindness, even if the world of men had forgotten his existence. On this particular October evening, as golden light slanted through the pines and the first frost painted the meadowgrass silver, Samuel sat on his porch whittling a new axe handle. The silence was profound, the kind of deep quiet that city folks found unsettling, but that filled his soul with contentment. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate, and the creek sang its eternal song over smooth stones worn by countless years of flowing water. He had no way of knowing that this evening would shatter the careful solitude of his life forever. The blade of his knife moved steadily against the hickory wood, each stroke bringing the handle closer to perfection. This was his world measured, predictable, safe. A world where disappointment couldn't reach him because he expected nothing from anyone except himself. The dying light caught the wedding ring on his left hand, not his own, but his mother's, worn on his pinky finger as the only link to family he had left. She had told him once that true love would find him when he least expected it, arriving like dawn after the darkest night. Samuel had smiled at her romantic notions then, believing himself destined for a solitary existence. As darkness settled over the valley and the coulee, first stars appeared between the pine boughs. Samuel finished his work and prepared to bank the fire for the night. Tomorrow would bring more of the same blessed routine: coffee, work, solitude, peace. He had no reason to suspect that before another sunrise, his entire understanding of love, purpose, and destiny would be forever changed by a stranger's desperate cry echoing through the forest night. The wind picked up, rustling the aspen leaves like whispered secrets, and Samuel paused at his cabin door. For just a moment, he felt as though the wilderness itself was holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to unfold. Then he shook his head at such fanciful thinking and stepped inside, closing the door on what he believed would be just another quiet night in his hermit's paradise. Part 2. A cry in the darkness. Samuel had barely settled into his chair by the fire when the cry reached him, faint but unmistakable, carried on the night wind like a prayer torn from desperate lips. He froze, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and listened with the intensity of a man who had learned to read the forest's every mood and message. There it was again. Not the call of an animal in distress, but something far more troubling. The sound of human suffering echoing through the darkness beyond his cabin walls. Samuel set down his cup and reached for the rifle that never strayed far from his side. Living alone in the wilderness taught a man to be prepared for anything, though in 12 years of solitude, he had never needed to fire a shot in anger. The cry came a third time, weaker now, as if whoever made it was losing the strength to call for help. Samuel's conscience, shaped by his mother's teachings and his own innate compassion, would not let him ignore such desperate need. He grabbed his coat and a lantern, checked that his knife was secure at his belt, and stepped into the crisp October night. The sound had come from the southeast, toward the dense grove of cedar trees where the creek bent sharply around a granite outcropping. Samuel moved carefully through the darkness, his lantern casting dancing shadows that transformed familiar landmarks into mysterious shapes. The night was alive with the usual sounds of the wilderness, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant howl of wolves calling to their pack, the soft splash of a beaver working somewhere upstream. But underneath it all, Samuel heard something that made his blood run cold. The rapid, shallow breathing of someone in terrible distress. He quickened his pace, pushing through a thicket of elderberry bushes that caught at his coat sleeves like grasping fingers. The lantern light revealed broken branches and disturbed earth signs that someone had stumbled through here recently, perhaps fleeing from danger or simply collapsing from exhaustion. Then he saw her, curled at the base of an ancient cedar tree. As still as death itself lay a young woman. Her dark hair spilled across the forest floor like ink against parchment, and her clothing buckskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork marked her as one of the native people who occasionally passed through this remote valley. But this was no peaceful traveler resting by choice. Even from several feet away, Samuel could see that she was desperately ill. Her skin burned with fever despite the cool night air, and her breathing came in short, labored gasps that spoke of lungs fighting for every breath. Her lips were cracked and pale, and her closed eyes were sunken with dehydration and exhaustion. Mud and pine needles clung to her dress, suggesting she had been wandering for days through the wilderness without proper care or shelter. Samuel hesitated for only a moment. His life of solitude had not prepared him for this, for the sudden appearance of a stranger, and a young woman at that, requiring immediate and intimate care to survive. But his mother's voice echoed in his memory. Kindness given in silence speaks the loudest. This was no time for hesitation or social awkwardness. This was a moment that would define the kind of man he truly was. He set the lantern down carefully and knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin confirmed his worst fears. She was burning up with fever, her body fighting an infection or illness that had already progressed dangerously far. Without immediate treatment, she would not survive until dawn. "Easy now," he whispered, though he doubted she could hear him in her current state. "You're not alone anymore." With infinite care, Samuel slipped his arms beneath her slight form and lifted her from the cold ground. She weighed no more than a child, her body alarmingly light in his strong arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse against his chest. Far too fast, like the heartbeat of a frightened bird. The journey back to his cabin seemed to take hours, though Samuel knew it was only minutes. Every step required careful attention to avoid roots and rocks that might cause him to stumble and further injure his fragile burden. The lantern, hooked over his arm, swayed with each movement, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance around them like spirits attending a sacred ritual. When he finally reached his cabin, Samuel kicked the door open and carried her directly to his bed, the only proper place to tend to someone so desperately ill. He laid her down with the same reverence he might show to something holy, then immediately set about building up the fire to drive away the night's chill dot as flames began to leap higher in the fireplace, casting warm light across the small cabin. Samuel got his first clear look at the young woman he had found. Despite her obvious illness and the harsh treatment of days spent wandering in the wilderness, he could see that she was beautiful, not in the painted, artificial way of saloon girls, but with the natural grace of someone who had lived her entire life in harmony with the land. Her dress, though stained and torn, had been crafted with obvious skill and care. The beadwork told stories he could not read, patterns that spoke of traditions passed down through countless generations. Silver ornaments in her hair caught the firelight, and around her neck hung a small leather pouch that undoubtedly contained items of spiritual significance. But it was her hands that moved him, most small and delicate, yet marked with the calluses of someone who knew honest work. These were hands that had gathered herbs and prepared medicine, that had sewn clothing and prepared food, that had comforted children and cared for the elderly. They were hands that belonged to someone who mattered deeply to people he would never meet. Samuel realized with a start that he had been staring, and he quickly turned his attention to the practical matters of keeping her alive. Time was running short, and he had work to do. Part 3. The healer's touch. Samuel moved through his cabin with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that every moment counted. From his small but well-organized collection of supplies, he gathered everything his mother had taught him about fighting fever and infection. The knowledge felt rusty from disuse. It had been years since he'd needed to tend to anything more serious than his own occasional cuts and bruises, but his mother's lessons had been thorough and loving, burned into his memory through repetition and care. First, he needed to bring down her fever before it could cause permanent harm. From a high shelf, he retrieved a mason jar filled with golden honey, harvested from wild hives he had discovered deep in the forest. His mother had always said that honey was nature's most perfect medicine. It fought infection, soothed throats, and provided strength when the body was too weak to accept other nourishment. Next, he stepped outside into his small garden, where herbs grew in neat rows beside vegetables he had planted for winter storage. Even in the darkness, his hands moved with certainty among the plants his mother had taught him to cultivate. Echinacea for fighting infection, willow bark for bringing down fever, and chamomile for easing pain and promoting rest. He gathered what he needed quickly, aware that every minute away from his patient was a minute her condition could worsen. Back inside, Samuel crushed the herbs with the same mortar and pestle his mother had used, grinding them into a fine paste that released their healing oils into the warm air of the cabin. The familiar scents brought back memories of his childhood times when he had been sick or injured, and his mother had tended to him with these same gentle hands and healing herbs. He mixed the herbal paste with honey until it formed a thick, golden syrup that would be easier for the unconscious woman to swallow. Then he returned to her side, noting with concern that her breathing had become even more labored and her fever seemed to be climbing higher despite the warmth of the cabin. "Come on now," he whispered, lifting her head gently and supporting it against his arm. "This will help you feel better." At first, she resisted unconsciously, her body too weak to cooperate even in its own salvation. But Samuel persisted with the patience of a man who had learned gentleness from caring for injured animals. Drop by drop, he coaxed the honey mixture past her lips, pausing whenever she seemed to struggle and speaking to her in the same soothing voice he used to calm spooked horses. "That's it," he murmured, as she finally began to swallow reflexively. "Just a little more. You're going to be all right." He wasn't sure if his words were meant to comfort her himself. The responsibility of another person's life weighing on his shoulders felt heavier than any burden he had ever carried. For 12 years, he had been accountable only to himself, free to succeed or fail based solely on his own actions. Now, suddenly, he held someone else's future in his rough, inexperienced hands. Throughout the long night, Samuel maintained his vigil beside her bed. Every hour, he checked her temperature by placing his palm against her forehead, monitoring the fever's rise and fall like a general tracking the movements of an enemy army. When her breathing became too shallow, he propped her up with extra pillows. When she began to shiver despite the fever, he covered her with every blanket he owned. Around midnight, she began to speak in her delirium soft words in a language he couldn't understand, but that sounded like music in the quiet cabin. Her voice carried the rhythm of ancient songs, of prayers passed down through generations, of stories told around campfires under star-filled skies. Samuel found himself leaning closer to catch every word, though their meaning remained as mysterious as the woman herself. "Easy now," he whispered when her voice became agitated, when whatever dreams or memories plagued her seemed to cause distress. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you." His own voice sounded strange to his ears. He hadn't spoken this much in months, and certainly never to a woman. But something about her helpless condition brought out a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. Perhaps this was what his mother had meant about kindness speaking loudest in silence. Sometimes, the most powerful thing a person could do was simply be present in another's moment of greatest need. As the hours passed, Samuel found himself studying her face in the flickering firelight. Even unconscious and burning with fever, she possessed a dignity that spoke of strength and courage. Her features suggested someone accustomed to hardship, but not broken by it, someone who had faced difficulties with grace and determination. There was something regal about the set of her jaw, something that suggested she was not accustomed to being helpless or dependent on others. This realization made Samuel even more determined to help her recover. Whatever circumstances had brought her to collapse alone in the wilderness, she deserved better than to die forgotten in a stranger's cabin. She deserved the chance to return to whatever life she had been living before illness and misfortune had brought her to his doorstep. Near dawn, her fever finally began to break. Samuel noticed it first in her breathing, which became deeper and more regular. Then her skin began to cool, and the terrible restlessness that had plagued her all night gave way to peaceful sleep. For the first time in hours, Samuel allowed himself to hope that she might actually survive. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through his cabin windows, painting everything in warm gold, the young woman's eyes slowly opened. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with an intelligence that made Samuel's breath catch in his throat. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other in silence, the hermit who had chosen solitude, and the stranger who had wandered into his carefully ordered world. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear and unmistakable. "You saved me." Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks, unaccustomed to such direct gratitude from anyone, especially a woman. He nodded awkwardly, his usual confidence deserting him completely in the face of her steady gaze. "Rest now," he managed to say. "You're safe here." She smiled then, just the faintest curve of her lips, but it was enough to make his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. In that moment, Samuel Whitmore began to understand that his life of peaceful solitude was about to change forever. Part 4. Words. That changed everything. For 3 days, Samuel tended to his unexpected guest with the careful attention of a man nursing a wounded bird back to flight. She slept most of the first day, waking only to accept small sips of broth or spoonfuls of honey-sweetened medicine. But with each passing hour, strength returned to her slight frame, and by the second day, she was able to sit up for short periods, watching him move about the cabin with curious, intelligent eyes. Samuel found himself stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking, fascinated by the way she observed everything around her with the keen attention of someone accustomed to reading meaning in the smallest details. She noticed how he banked the fire to last through the night, how he organized his simple possessions with military precision, how he moved through his daily routines with the efficiency of a man, who had learned to depend entirely on himself. On the third day, she insisted on helping despite his protests that she needed to conserve her strength. She proved surprisingly capable, stirring the pot of stew he had prepared while he gathered firewood, humming softly in a language that sounded like water flowing over stones. The cabin, which had echoed with nothing but his own footsteps and the crackle of flames for so many years, now pulsed with a different kind of life. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, she finally began to speak of herself. Her name was Ayana, she told him, which meant eternal blossom in the tongue of her people. She came from a band of Lakota who followed the buffalo herds across the northern plains, living as their ancestors had lived for countless generations. Before the coming of the white settlements, I was to be married, she said quietly, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames, to a warrior chosen by the council of elders, a man of great reputation and many horses. Samuel felt an unexpected tightness in his chest at these words, though he couldn't understand why the mention of another man should affect him so strongly. He had no claim on this woman beyond having saved her life, no right to feel anything beyond satisfaction at her recovery. The marriage would have been good for both our families. Ayana continued, her voice growing softer. My father would have received many gifts, and I would have been protected by a man strong enough to provide for children and defend against enemies. But Samuel prompted gently, sensing that there was more to the story. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeing visions in the dancing flames. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of sadness that made Samuel's heart ache for her. But I could not love him, she said simply. My heart remained as cold as winter stone when he spoke to me. When he touched my hand, I felt nothing but duty. The spirits whispered to me in dreams that this was not the path they had chosen for my life. She turned to look at Samuel directly, and he was struck again by the depth of intelligence and strength in her dark eyes. When the fever sickness came to our camp, many fell ill. The medicine woman said it was a test from the spirits, that those who survived were meant for special purposes. But when I became sick, my promised husband, he turned away from me. He said a woman who brought sickness could not be a good wife, that the spirits had marked me as unlucky. Samuel felt a surge of anger at the cruelty of abandoning someone in their moment of greatest need. What did your people do? They left me beside a sacred grove to die or recover as the spirits willed, Ayana said matter-of-factly, as if such abandonment was a natural part of life. If I lived, it would prove the spirits still had work for me to do. If I died, it would mean my time in this world was finished. The casual way she spoke of being left to die alone struck Samuel like a physical blow. He had lived in solitude by choice, surrounded by the peace and beauty of the wilderness. But she had been forced into isolation as punishment for something beyond her control, abandoned by the very people who should have protected her. I wandered for many days, she continued, her voice growing even quieter. The fever made me see strange visions, and I became lost in country I had never seen before. I remember following a creek, thinking that water would lead me to safety. But each day I grew weaker, and I began to understand that I would never see my family again. I'm sorry, Samuel said, the words feeling inadequate but sincere. No one should have to face such trials alone. Ayana studied his face in the firelight, and Samuel felt as though she was looking not just at him, but into him, reading secrets he didn't even know he carried. But I was not meant to die in that place, she said softly. The spirits guided my steps to this valley, to the tree where you found me. They brought me to a man whose heart holds no anger, no greed, no hunger for power over others. A man who saves strangers without asking for reward. Samuel shifted uncomfortably under her intense gaze. I only did what anyone would do. No, Ayana said with quiet certainty. Most would have left me to die. Some would have taken advantage of my weakness. Others might have helped, but only for what they could gain in return. You asked for nothing. You gave freely of your medicine, your food, your time, your own bed. You sat awake through the night to watch over a stranger. She reached out slowly and placed her small, warm hand over his rough, calloused one. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through Samuel's entire body. Not just the simple awareness of physical contact, but something deeper and more profound. "In the ways of my people," she said, her voice carrying the weight of ancient tradition, "when someone saves not just your life, but your spirit, when they show kindness without thought of reward, we do not call this chance. We call this destiny." Samuel's mouth went dry, and he found himself unable to look away from her steady gaze. "I don't understand." Ayanna leaned closer, her breath warm against his face and sweetened by the honey he had used to heal her. When she spoke, her words fell like a sacred vow, both tender and commanding. "You are my chosen one." The fire crackled and hissed, shadows dancing on the cabin walls as if the entire world was bearing witness to her declaration. Samuel's heart pounded so hard, he was certain she could hear it in the sudden silence that filled the space between them. He had lived his entire adult life convinced that he was meant for solitude, that love and companionship belonged to other men who possessed qualities he lacked. Yet here sat this remarkable woman, looking at him as if he was something precious and rare, speaking words that transformed his understanding of everything he thought he knew about himself and his place in the world. "I don't know if I'm worthy of such words," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Ayanna smiled then, an expression of such warmth and certainty that it seemed to light up the entire cabin. "The spirits do not make mistakes," she said simply. "They led me to you because my heart was meant to find its home here, in this place, with this man who lives with honor, even when no one is watching." Samuel felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking, but opening, like ice giving way to the warmth of spring. For the first time in his life, he began to understand what his mother had meant when she spoke of love arriving like dawn after the darkest night. Part 5. Building a life together. Days that followed Ayanna's declaration flowed like honey, sweet and golden and measured. Samuel discovered that sharing his solitary world with another person didn't diminish his peace. It transformed it into something richer and more complex. Where once he had found contentment in silence, he now discovered joy in the sound of Ayanna's laughter echoing through the cabin. Where he had once treasured the predictability of his routines, he now looked forward to the small surprises she brought to each day. Ayanna proved to be a natural partner in the rhythms of wilderness life. She rose each morning before dawn to tend the fire, moving through the cabin with the quiet grace of someone who understood that the early hours were sacred time. While Samuel checked his trap lines or fished the creek, she gathered wild herbs and roots, her knowledge of plants and their uses proving to be even more extensive than his mother's had been taught in the evenings. They would sit by the fire while she taught him words in her native tongue, and he shared stories from the books that had been his only companions for so many years. Her quick mind grasped English with remarkable ease, though she spoke it with an accent that made even simple words sound like music. Samuel found himself listening to her voice with the same attention he had once reserved for the call of birds or the whisper of wind through pine branches. "Your mother," Ayanna said one evening as she watched him preparing medicine from the herbs they had gathered together. "She taught you well. These are not white man's ways of healing." Samuel paused in his grinding of willow bark, thinking of the gentle woman who had raised him alone after his father's death in a mining accident. She learned from a Shoshone woman when she was young, said that wisdom belonged to whoever was willing to learn it, regardless of the color of their skin. She was wise. Ayanna nodded approvingly. "Many of your people do not understand that the earth offers healing to all who know how to listen to her voice." It was conversations like these that made Samuel realize how much his world was expanding. For years, He had believed that his simple life contained everything he needed to know. Now, through Ayana's eyes, he was seeing layers of meaning and connection that had always existed but had remained invisible to his solitary perspective. She showed him how to read the flight patterns of migrating birds to predict changes in weather days before they arrived. She taught him which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would bring visions, which stones held the best medicine power, and which trees sang the clearest songs when the wind was right. Most importantly, she showed him that the wilderness he had always seen as his refuge was actually a living, breathing community of which he had been only one small member. But even as their days together took on the comfortable rhythm of an established partnership, Samuel noticed that Ayana would sometimes pause in her work to listen to sounds he couldn't detect. Her head would tilt slightly, her dark eyes would grow distant, and her entire body would become still as carved stone. When he asked what she heard, she would smile and shake her head, but he caught glimpses of worry in her expression that she tried to hide. One morning in late October, as the first snow dusted the peaks of the distant mountains, Samuel understood what she had been listening for. He was splitting wood behind the cabin when he noticed movement at the edge of the clearing, dark figures on horseback, barely visible among the shadows of the pine trees. They didn't approach or call out, but their presence was unmistakable. They watched for perhaps 10 minutes, then melted back into the forest as silently as they had appeared. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Samuel finally spoke of what he had seen. "There were riders watching the cabin today." Ayana nodded without surprise. "I know. They have been there for 3 days now, sometimes 4 or 5 of them, sometimes only 2. They are from my people." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling weather. "Have they come to take you back?" "They have come to see what manner of man has claimed one of their daughters," Ayana said simply. "To determine if you are worthy of the choice I have made." The weight of being judged by men whose customs and language he didn't understand settled heavily on Samuel's shoulders. "And if they decide I'm not worthy?" Ayana turned to face him, her expression serious but unafraid. "They cannot unmake what the spirits have already decided. But it would be easier for both our peoples if they could accept our union with blessing rather than resistance." Samuel reached for her hand, marveling again at how perfectly it fit within his own rough palm. "What do? We live as we have been living," she said with quiet certainty. "We show them through our actions that what has grown between us is real and strong and meant to be. Truth has a way of making itself known to those willing to see it." Her calm confidence helped ease some of Samuel's worry, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful time together was about to face its first serious test. That night, he lay awake listening to the wind in the trees and wondering what kind of man the watching warriors saw when they looked at him. Was he someone worthy of the remarkable woman sleeping peacefully beside him, or just a lonely hermit who had stumbled into good fortune he didn't deserve? The next morning brought an answer to his questions in the form of a single rider who approached the cabin openly in the full light of day. Samuel and Ayana stepped onto the porch together to meet their visitor, a man perhaps 50 years old, his long gray hair braided with feathers and his weathered face bearing the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected entire communities. He spoke to Ayana in their shared language, his voice carrying the formal tones of official business. She responded respectfully, but firmly, her chin held high with quiet pride. Samuel couldn't understand the words being exchanged, but the body language told him that this was some kind of negotiation or test. Finally, the elder turned his attention to Samuel, studying him with eyes that seemed to see past all pretense to the essential truth of a man's character. When he spoke, it was in English heavily accented but clear. "You are the one who saved our daughter from the spirit sickness. I found her when she was ill, and did what I could to help," Samuel replied, meeting the man's steady gaze without flinching. "Anyone would have done the same." The elder's expression might have been the ghost of a smile. You believe this? Samuel considered the question seriously before answering. I believe it's what decent people do for one another, regardless of the differences between them. This time, the elder definitely smiled. Though it was gone so quickly, Samuel almost missed it. Ayana has chosen to bind her life to yours according to the old ways. This choice cannot be unmade by others, but it can be honored or dishonored by the actions that follow. Samuel nodded, understanding that he was being given both a blessing and a warning. I'll do everything in my power to honor the trust she's placed in me. The elder studied him for another long moment, then spoke again to Ayana in their own language. She responded with obvious pleasure, and Samuel saw relief in her shoulders as some invisible tension left her body. What did he say? Samuel asked after the rider had disappeared back into the forest. He said that the spirits have good judgment in choosing hearts that can recognize each other across the boundaries of different peoples. Ayana replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief. He said that as long as we live with honor and treat each other with the respect due to a sacred bond, we will have the blessing of both our peoples. Samuel pulled her into his arms, feeling as though an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time since she had spoken the words, "You are my chosen one," he began to truly believe that he might actually be worthy of the gift he had been given. As winter settled over their valley and the watching riders faded back into the vastness of the plains, Samuel and Ayana began building something that belonged entirely to them, a life that honored both their backgrounds, while creating something entirely new. It was, Samuel realized, exactly what his mother had meant when she spoke of love arriving unexpected and transformative, changing everything it touched into something better than what had come before. Part 6. The test of winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the Canadian peaks with a ferocity that caught even Samuel by surprise. By November, snow lay 3 feet deep around the cabin, and the creek where he usually fished had frozen solid except for a small patch of open water near the spring. The cold was so intense that the sap in the pine trees froze and cracked with sounds like rifle shots echoing through the forest. For most men, living alone in such isolation, winter meant months of careful rationing, of making every piece of firewood and every jar of preserved food stretch until spring returned. But with Ayana sharing his small world, Samuel discovered that even the harshest season could be transformed into something approaching paradise. She had brought skills to their partnership that complemented his own in ways he was still discovering. While he was expert at hunting and fishing, at building and maintaining their shelter, she possessed knowledge of plants and weather patterns that made survival not just possible but comfortable. She showed him how to find edible roots beneath the snow, how to read the behavior of animals to predict the worst storms days before they arrived, and how to prepare foods that would keep them healthy through the long months when fresh meat was scarce. More importantly, she filled the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning in their hearth. In the evenings, when the wind howled outside and ice crystals formed on the inside of their windows, she would tell him stories passed down through generations of her people, tales of brave warriors and wise women, of spirits who walked among humans and animals who possessed souls as complex as any person. Samuel found himself sharing stories too, memories of his childhood with his mother, passages from the books that had educated him, dreams and hopes he had never spoken aloud to another living soul. In the flickering light of their fire, with snow muffling all sound from the outside world, their conversations took on an intimacy he had never experienced with another human being. "Tell me about your father," Ayana said one especially cold night in December, as they lay together beneath every blanket Samuel owned, listening to the storm rage outside their solid walls. Samuel was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. His father was a subject he rarely spoke of, even to himself. But something about the safety of their shared warmth, the trust that had grown between them over the months since she had entered his life, made him want to open that old wound to the healing light of her understanding. His name was Thomas Whitmore, Samuel said finally. He was a good man, but not a lucky one. He worked in the silver mines near Leadville, trying to save enough money to buy land and start a proper farm. He used to tell me and my mother about the ranch he was going to build, the cattle he was going to raise, the life we were going to have once he struck it rich. Ayanna waited patiently, understanding that such stories required their own time to unfold. He died when I was 12, Samuel continued, his voice growing rougher with old pain. There was a cave-in deep in the mine. They said it took them 3 days to dig out the bodies. My mother never quite recovered from losing him. She tried to be strong for my sake, but I could see how the grief ate at her like a slow poison. She lived 8 more years after that, but part of her died in that mine with him. Ayanna's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his own in a gesture of comfort that spoke louder than any words could have. After she passed, I couldn't stand being around other people, Samuel continued. Everyone in town looked at me with pity, or they wanted to tell me stories about what a good man my father had been, as if I didn't already know. I felt like I was suffocating on their sympathy. So I came here, to this valley, and I built this cabin with my own hands. I told myself I was choosing freedom, but maybe I was just running away from the pain of losing them both. Running towards something is not the same as running away from it, Ayanna said softly. The spirits guided you here for a reason, just as they guided me. Perhaps your parents. Love created this place where our hearts could find each other. Her words carried such gentle certainty that Samuel felt some of the old ache in his chest begin to ease. For years, he had carried guilt about leaving the world his parents had known, about choosing solitude over the community they had valued. But Ayanna helped him see his choice differently, not as abandonment, but as preparation for something greater than he had been able to imagine. The worst storm of the winter struck in early January, bringing winds that screamed like living things and snow that fell so thick they couldn't see their own woodshed from the cabin windows. For 3 days, they were completely cut off from the outside world, existing in a small circle of warmth and light while nature raged with terrifying power beyond their walls. On the 3rd night, when the storm finally began to exhaust itself, they heard something that made Samuel's blood run cold, a scratching at their door, accompanied by a low whimpering that spoke of desperate need. Samuel grabbed his rifle and approached the door cautiously, aware that a wounded or desperate animal could be just as dangerous as any human threat. But when he cracked the door open, what he found was not a wild creature, but a dog, a large, shaggy animal that looked like a cross between a wolf and a shepherd, nearly frozen and clearly starving. Its eyes held intelligence and pleading that reminded Samuel powerfully of his first sight of Ayanna beside the cedar tree. "Bring him in," Ayanna said immediately, already moving to warm blankets by the fire. "Quickly, before he freezes." Samuel didn't hesitate. Whatever else this animal might represent, it was clearly in desperate need of help, and both his own nature and Ayanna's example had taught him that such need trumped all other considerations. He carried the half-frozen dog inside, noting that despite its wild appearance, it wore a collar made of braided leather decorated with beadwork similar to Ayanna's clothing dot as they worked together to warm and feed their unexpected guest. Ayanna spoke to the animal in her own language, her voice carrying tones of recognition and concern. The dog responded to her words, its tail beginning a weak wag as strength returned to its exhausted body. "He belongs to my people," she explained to Samuel. "His name is Dakota. It means friend to all in our tongue. He must have been searching for me since the snows began." Samuel felt a complicated mix of emotions at this news. The dog's arrival was tangible proof that Ayanna's former life was not as distant as their peaceful winter had made it seem. But it also represented something hopeful, evidence that her people had not completely written her off, that they cared enough to send a search party, even if that party consisted of only one loyal animal. Over the following days, as Dakota recovered his strength and settled into their small household, Samuel began to understand that the dog's presence was actually a blessing rather than a complication. The animal proved to be an excellent hunter and an even better guardian, alerting them to approaching wildlife and helping Samuel track game through the deep snow. More importantly, Dakota seemed to complete their small family in a way that felt natural and right. The spirit sent him to us, Ayana said one evening as they watched the dog sleep peacefully by their fire, his belly full of venison stew and his coat finally clean and glossy with good health. He will be the bridge between my old life and our new one, carrying news of our happiness to those who wonder about my fate. Samuel was beginning to understand that in Ayana's worldview, nothing happened by pure chance. Every event, from the storm that had brought her to his valley to the dog that had somehow found them in the depths of winter, was part of a larger pattern woven by forces greater than human understanding. It was a perspective that brought meaning and purpose to experiences that Samuel had always seen as merely random. As February arrived and the worst of the winter began to loosen its grip on their valley, Samuel realized that the months of isolation had changed him in fundamental ways. The man who had once believed himself incapable of love had discovered reserves of tenderness and devotion he hadn't known he possessed. The hermit who had convinced himself that solitude was strength had learned that sharing his life with another person didn't diminish him. It revealed aspects of himself that had been waiting years to emerge. When Ayana fell asleep in his arms each night, her breathing soft and regular against his chest, Samuel would lie awake marveling at the transformation that had overtaken his carefully ordered world. Everything he had thought he knew about himself, about what he wanted from life, about what was possible for a man like him, had been proven wrong in the most beautiful way imaginable. Outside their cabin, the winter winds still howled through the pines, and snow still fell in the moonlight. But inside, surrounded by warmth and love and the steady presence of their four-legged guardian, Samuel Whitmore had found something more precious than all the silver his father had died trying to find a home for his heart that would last for all the seasons to come. Part 7. Spring Trials and Deeper. Bonds. When spring finally broke winter's grip on their valley, it arrived with a rush of melting snow that turned the peaceful creek into a roaring torrent and filled the air with the sound of rushing water and the calls of returning birds. Samuel and Ayana emerged from their cabin like people waking from a dream, blinking in the bright sunlight and marveling at how much the world had changed while they had been cocooned in their winter sanctuary. The months of isolation had strengthened their bond in ways that went beyond mere companionship. They had learned to anticipate each other's needs, to communicate with glances and gestures as much as words, to work together with the seamless coordination of people who had found their perfect complement in another human being. Dakota had become an integral part of their small family, his presence adding an element of playfulness and protection that made their isolated life feel complete. But spring also brought reminders that they were not truly alone in the wilderness. As the snow melted and travel became possible again, they began to see signs of human activity in the valley footprints near the creek, the remains of a campfire in a clearing half a mile from their cabin, and most significantly, the clear tracks of unshod horses that suggested riders from Ayana's people had been observing them throughout the winter months. They never truly left. Ayana explained one morning as they examined fresh tracks in the mud near their garden plot. My people do not abandon their own, even when someone chooses a different path. They have been watching to ensure our survival and to see how we conduct ourselves when we believe we are unobserved. Samuel felt a mixture of admiration and unease at this revelation. He respected the loyalty that would drive people to maintain such a vigil through the harsh winter months, but the idea of being constantly watched made him uncomfortable in ways he struggled to articulate. Are you troubled by their presence? Ayana asked, reading his expression with the insight that had developed between them over the months of sharing every thought and feeling that Samuel considered her question carefully before answering. I respect their concern for you, and I understand why they would want to be certain you're being treated well. But I've lived alone for so long that the thought of being judged and evaluated makes me feel ... exposed, I suppose. Ayana nodded thoughtfully. Among my people, privacy as you understand, it does not exist. We live in small communities where everyone's actions affect everyone else. A man's character is known by how he behaves, not just in public moments, but in all the small daily choices that reveal his true nature. She reached out to take his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. But you should not fear their judgment. They have watched you through an entire winter, seen how you care for me, how you treat our dog, how you maintain your home and conduct yourself when you believe no one is watching. If they had found you lacking in any way, they would have acted long before now. Her confidence in him was touching, but Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful isolation was about to be tested in ways they hadn't yet imagined. That feeling proved prophetic when, 3 days later, they received their first official visitors since the elders' autumn assessment. Samuel was working. In their expanded garden, they had decided to plant more vegetables this year to accommodate their growing household went to quotas. Sudden alertness warned him of approaching riders. The dog didn't bark or show aggression, but his entire body became tense with attention, suggesting that whoever was coming was known but not necessarily welcomed. Moments later, 3 riders emerged from the forest and approached their cabin with the unhurried confidence of people who had every right to be there. Samuel recognized the gray-haired elder from their autumn meeting, but the 2 younger men with him were strangers warriors in their prime, their faces painted with symbols. Samuel didn't understand that clearly held significant meaning. Ayana appeared on the cabin porch, her expression calm but alert. She spoke to the visitors in her own language, her tone respectful but not subservient. Samuel noticed that she positioned herself slightly in front of him, not to protect him from physical danger, but to serve as a bridge between his world and theirs. The conversation that followed was lengthy and serious, conducted entirely in the Lakota tongue. Samuel could only stand and listen, reading what meaning he could from gestures and expressions, feeling increasingly frustrated by his inability to understand what was being discussed. At one point, the younger warriors looked at him with expressions that might have been skepticism or challenge, and he felt his muscles tense with the instinctive response of a man who had learned to rely on himself in all situations. Finally, Ayana turned to him and spoke in English, though Samuel could tell she was choosing her words carefully, translating not just language, but cultural concepts that had no direct equivalent in his experience. "There has been trouble with white settlers to the south," she said, her voice steady but troubled. "Armed men have been attacking isolated camps, stealing horses, and killing people who try to resist. The tribal council is concerned that my presence here might bring similar danger to our valley, or that you might be mistaken for one of the raiders if you're seen with." Samuel felt his jaw tighten with anger, not at the messengers, but at the situation they described. "What are they asking us to do?" "They want to know if you would be willing to temporarily separate, for both our safety, until the troubles pass. You could stay here, and I could return to live with my people until it's safe for us to be together again." The suggestion hit Samuel like a physical blow. After months of building a life together, after discovering a completeness he had never known was possible, the thought of voluntarily giving up what they had found was almost unthinkable. "And what did you tell them?" he asked. Ayana's smile was small but fierce. "I told them that the spirits do not separate what they have joined together for the convenience of frightened men. I told them that if danger comes to this valley, we will face it together, as we have faced everything else." The elder spoke again, his words carrying the weight of authority and concern. Ayana listened respectfully, then translated once more. He says that love is admirable, but it cannot stop bullets or prevent raiders from burning our home. He reminds me that I am still young and could find another husband if something were to happen to you, but that your death would be permanent and pointless. Samuel stepped forward, meeting the elder's eyes directly. Tell him that I appreciate his concern for both our safety, but tell him also that some things are more important than mere survival. A life without honor, without loyalty to those we love, without the courage to stand by our commitments when they're tested, that's not really living at all. Ayana translated his words, and Samuel saw something that might have been approval flicker in the elder's weathered features. The younger warriors exchanged glances that suggested they were seeing him in a new light, evaluating him not just as a white man who had taken one of their women, but as someone who understood concepts of duty and courage that transcended racial boundaries. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical matters of defense and communication. The elder explained that warriors would continue to patrol the area, keeping watch for raiders while respecting Samuel and Ayana's desire to remain together. In return, Samuel agreed to learn specific signals that would allow him to communicate with the patrols if danger threatened, and to accept weapons and training that would make him more capable of protecting both himself and Ayana if the need arose. As the riders prepared to leave, the elder approached Samuel once more and spoke to him directly in English. "You have surprised us," he said simply. "When Ayana first chose you, some among our people believed she had been weakened by her illness, that she was choosing safety over wisdom. But a man who would risk everything to stand by his woman, even when offered an easier path, is not someone to be dismissed lightly." After the riders had disappeared back into the forest, Samuel and Ayana sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the valley that had become their world. Dakota lay at their feet, his presence a comforting reminder that they were not entirely alone in their determination to face whatever challenges might come. "Were you afraid I might choose separation?" Ayana asked quietly. Samuel considered his answer carefully. "For a moment, yes. Not because I doubted your love, but because I've never had to trust anyone else with decisions that affected my survival. Learning to believe that someone else's interests are truly the same as my own, that's harder than I expected it to be." Ayana leaned against his shoulder, her warmth a reassurance that spoke louder than words. "My people have a saying, the strongest trees are those that bend together in the storm while keeping their roots intertwined. We are like those trees now. We may sway with the winds that blow against us, but our roots have grown together too deeply to be separated." As night fell over their valley and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Samuel Whitmore realized that love was not just about finding someone who completed you in peaceful times. It was about discovering someone who would stand beside you when the world itself seemed determined to tear you apart. Someone whose courage and commitment made you stronger than you had ever imagined you could be. The trials that spring had brought to their doorstep were far from over. But for the first time, Samuel faced an uncertain future without fear. Whatever storms lay ahead, he would weather them with Ayana at his side, their love serving as both anchor and compass in the turbulent times to come. Part 8. Love Conquers All. The summer that followed brought both the trials the elder had warned them about and a deepening of the bond between Samuel and Ayana that transformed them from two people learning to live together into something approaching a single spirit inhabiting two bodies. The rumors of violence in the surrounding territories proved tragically accurate, and twice during the hottest months they spotted smoke on the horizon that spoke of settlements burning and lives lost to the senseless hatred that seemed to follow wherever different peoples tried to share the same land. But their valley remained untouched by the violence, protected perhaps by its isolation, or by the vigilant patrols of Lakota warriors who had come to accept Samuel is something more than a temporary curiosity in Ayana's life. He had proven himself during a tense encounter in late July when 3 armed men had approached their cabin, clearly intent on mischief. Samuel's calm competence with the rifle the elder had given him, combined with the sudden appearance of war-painted warriors emerging from the forest like avenging spirits, had sent the would-be raiders fleeing without a shot being fired. "You did not hesitate to stand between me and danger," Ayana had said that evening as they sat by their fire, still processing the afternoon's events. "Even when you were outnumbered, even when you knew that protecting me might cost your life." Samuel had simply nodded, surprised to discover that the choice to risk everything for her had required no thought at all. It had been as natural and automatic as breathing, as instinctive as his own heartbeat. In that moment, he finally understood what the elder had meant about love being proven through actions rather than words. As autumn painted their valley in shades of gold and crimson, Ayana began showing signs of a change that filled Samuel with wonder and terror in equal measure. She moved with a new kind of careful grace, resting more often than usual and spending long minutes with her hands pressed against her still flat belly, her expression soft with secret knowledge. "I am carrying your child," she told him one crisp October morning as they walked together beside the creek where he had first learned to find peace in solitude. "The spirits have blessed our union with new life." Samuel stopped walking entirely, his mind struggling to process words that changed everything about their future in the span of a single sentence. A child, his child, a tiny person who would carry both his blood and Ayana's, who would bridge the gap between their two worlds in ways they were only beginning to imagine. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayana smiled with the serene confidence of a woman who had learned to read the subtle signals of her own body. "The signs are clear to those who know how to see them. By spring, we will be 3 instead of 2. The magnitude of this news settled over Samuel like a warm blanket, bringing with it a sense of responsibility and purpose that dwarfed everything he had ever felt before. He was going to be a father. This remarkable woman who had chosen to bind her life to his was going to bear his child, creating a legacy that would outlive them both. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted, his honesty carrying the weight of a confession. "I barely remember my own father, and I've lived alone for so long. "You will learn," Ayana said with quiet certainty. "Just as you learn to love. Just as you learn to share your solitary world with another person. The spirits do not give us challenges we are not capable of meeting." That evening, as they sat by their fire planning for the future that was growing inside Ayana's womb, Samuel felt a completeness that went beyond anything he had experienced before. His life had begun as a series of losses, his father to the mines, his mother to grief, his connection to the human community to his own choice of isolation. But somehow, through the mysterious workings of fate or destiny, or whatever force had guided Ayana's steps to his valley, all those losses had led him to this moment of perfect fulfillment. The winter that followed was gentler than the previous year, as if nature herself was conspiring to make Ayana's pregnancy as comfortable as possible. Samuel became even more attentive to her needs, learning to read the subtle changes in her body and mood, adjusting their daily routines to accommodate the new life growing within her. He found himself talking to her belly in the evenings, telling their unborn child stories about the valley where he or she would grow up, describing the animals and trees and seasons that would form the landscape of their childhood. Spring arrived with its usual rush of melting snow and returning life. But this year, it carried additional significance. As Ayana's time grew near, she began preparing for the birth, with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that bringing new life into the world was both the most natural and most sacred of all human experiences. The elder and several women from her tribe arrived in early May, setting up a temporary camp near Samuel's cabin to assist with the birth, and to welcome the new child according to traditional customs. Samuel felt some of his old anxiety about being observed and judged, but it was overwhelmed by gratitude for the support they offered and the knowledge they brought to an experience that was completely new to him. On a warm morning, when the valley was alive with birdsong and the scent of wildflowers, Ayanna went into labor. Samuel had assisted with the birth of calves and foals, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of human childbirth, for the primal power of a woman bringing new life into the world through her own strength and determination. "Your son is eager to meet you," one of the older women announced as dawn broke over their valley, presenting Samuel with a tiny, perfect baby boy whose cries filled the cabin with the sound of pure life. Samuel took his son in his trembling hands, marveling at the impossibly small fingers and toes, the downy dark hair that marked him as Ayanna's child, the bright eyes that seemed to focus on his father's face with unmistakable recognition. In that moment, holding his firstborn son while Ayanna rested peacefully after her labor, Samuel Whitmore understood that his transformation from lonely hermit to family man was complete. They named the baby Thomas, after Samuel's father, but gave him the Lakota name Wichapi, meaning star, to honor both sides of his heritage. As the weeks passed and Samuel learned to change diapers and warm bottles and soothe a crying infant in the middle of the night, he discovered that parenthood brought its own kind of completion to his relationship with Ayanna. "Look how he watches you," Ayanna said one evening as they sat together on their porch, baby Thomas nursing contentedly while Dakota dozed at their feet. "He knows already that you are his protector, his teacher, the man who will show him how to live with honor in the world." Samuel studied his son's face, seeing traces of both his own features and Ayanna's, but also something entirely unique, the beginning of a person who would make his own mark on the world. "I want to be worthy of that trust." "You already are," Ayanna said simply. "The man who saved a dying stranger, who chose love over loneliness, who stood ready to die rather than abandon his family. That man will raise a son who understands what it means to live with courage and compassion." As summer deepened and little Thomas grew stronger, Samuel began to see their valley through new eyes. This was no longer just a refuge from the world's complexities, but the foundation of a legacy that would extend far beyond his own lifetime. His son would grow up here, learning to fish in the same creek where Samuel had found solitude, playing beneath the same pine trees that had witnessed his parents' first meeting, breathing air that carried the scent of wildflowers and wood smoke, and all the things that made this place home. The watching warriors had become friends and protectors, stopping by regularly to check on the growing family and to ensure that the violence plaguing other parts of the territory never reached their peaceful valley. Samuel had learned enough of their language to communicate basic ideas, and they had accepted him fully as one of their own, not because of his race, but because of the character he had demonstrated through his actions. On a crisp autumn evening, as the first anniversary of Thomas's birth approached, Samuel sat alone on his porch while Ayanna sang their son to sleep inside the cabin. The solitude that had once defined his existence was still available to him when he needed it, but it no longer felt like the most important aspect of his life. Instead of emptiness, his moments alone were filled with reflection on the incredible journey that had brought him from lonely hermit to beloved husband and devoted father. Dakota padded out to join him, the faithful dog now graying around the muzzle, but still alert and protective of his adopted family. Samuel scratched behind the animal's ears, remembering the frozen, desperate creature they had rescued from the winter storm. Like everything else in their lives, Dakota's presence had proven to be part of a larger design that none of them could have anticipated, but all of them had been meant to fulfill. "Thank you," Samuel said quietly to the stars appearing in the darkening sky, to his parents whose love had shaped him, to the mysterious forces that had guided Ayanna's steps to his valley, to the woman whose voice he could hear singing ancient lullabies to their child. Thank you for showing me that love doesn't diminish a man. It reveals who he was always meant to become. Inside the cabin, Ayana finished her song and joined him on the porch, baby Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over the valley that had become their world, listening to the gentle sounds of night settling over their home. Samuel Whitmore had begun his adult life, believing that he was destined for solitude, that his greatest strength lay in needing no one except himself. But the woman who had once whispered, "You are my chosen one," had shown him a different kind of strength, the courage to open his heart completely, to trust another person with his deepest vulnerabilities, to build something beautiful and lasting with someone whose love had transformed him into the man he was always meant to be. In the years that followed, their family would grow, their love would deepen, and their valley would ring with the laughter of children who belonged fully to both worlds from which their parents had come. But the foundation of it all would always be that moment when a dying stranger had looked into the eyes of a lonely hermit and seen not just someone willing to save her life, but someone worthy of sharing his soul. The hermit of Cedar Creek had found his destiny, and it was more beautiful than any solitude he had ever imagined.